Welcome. This tutorial is going to pick up where we left off. In the last tutorial, we used this simple scene to basically be able to switch between two scenes and to build a simple project that as a standalone app. If you didn't follow the previous tutorial and you're just popping in now, basically if you just create a plane or some sort of assets, all we're going to be focusing on in this tutorial is how to use Bolt and the UI system to be able to enable mouse clicks and other events to have option. Maybe it's an options menu, or there's some other settings that the player needs to set, or potentially you just have an interface that requires them to use their mouse to click on different items in order to use those items. So whatever the case, this is going to go over how to set that up. So to start with, we are going to do the basics of just, let's go ahead and add some UI elements, and then we will look at how to proceed from there. So to start with, if we go down to Game Objects and go down to UI, we're going to be dealing with buttons. Now, if you have TextMesh Pro installed, great. It's a lot nicer than just using the standard stuff. But if not, it doesn't really matter, because you'll see when I create a button here, what it does is it creates the canvas, the button, the event system, and then the text TMP object as a child, right? That's the text that shows up here that says button. And so if I was to create a normal button, if I just go to component, or sorry, go to game object, UI, button, there we go, right? It creates a button as well, but this button just has a text object in it. And so it's a little bit different. The text looks a little different, and there's not as many options and things, but whatever the case, either one will have very similar, the connections and everything are going to be really similar. So I'm going to create both of those so I can do one of each so you can see. So let's start by, so we've got, I've created two buttons. That should be enough to give us some feedback, but let's go ahead and we're going to create a slider as well. So I'm just going to go Game Object, UI. I'm going to go down to Slider. Okay, so I've got all of these three things set up. So let's go ahead and now move them so we can actually see what we're doing. I want them all along the bottom, and my goal is just really to space them along the bottom edge. So I'm going to leave this first button that I created where it is in the bottom left corner. This next one I'm going to select. I'm going to come over here, click on this option here, and remember I'm going to hold down Option or Alt and click on this to pop it over to this far side. And then I'm going to select my slider. I'm going to click here. I'm going to hold down Option, and I'm going to click Bottom Center. I have no idea what this slider does. There's no text attached to it whatsoever right now, and that's fine. We're just going to leave these as they are. Okay, so let's go ahead and just change the text a bit so we have some idea which is which. So I'm going to select my text, my TextMesh Pro. If you don't have TextMesh Pro installed, just go ahead and create a second button. So I'm going to say TextMesh Pro here, and I'm just going to call this button 1. I'm going to jump to the text on button 2, and I'm going to call this, oops, I'm going to call it button 2. All right. So who knows what these buttons do, but they do something. And then for the slider, if I pop this open, you'll see there's this background area in here. And currently, right, there's no material. There's lots of different options I can have in here. Note that they say they are raycast targets, blah, 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 maskable, etc. We're not going to go too much into the depth in terms of what these things are. But my slider here, right, just a couple notes. I could have a graphic on here, right? So there's a lot you can do with this, but we're just going to leave it at the basics. If you want to change, right, the normal color, let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to have a different normal and different highlighted color and a different pressed color. And you can choose whatever you want them to be. I'm going to make it this muddy yellow, right? I'm going to go ahead and my highlighted color, maybe it'll be like a teal. So it's really obvious. And my pressed color is going to be, let's just make it green. Okay. And then my selected color and disabled color, we're not going to worry about those right now. the color multiplier, right, I can basically make it flatter or stronger. It's up to you. I'm going to leave it at the default, and obviously we don't have any graphic, and this is for the handle, right? This is just this little dot here. Okay, so so I've got those set. Navigation is automatic. We're not going to worry about any of those other settings right now. But then if I click on my background here real quick, right, that's where I can say, I could set this to, we're not using a blue or a violet, right? So that's where I can change the color of the slider itself. So go ahead, and if you want to change the color of the buttons, you can go ahead and do the same thing. You'll note that, again, we have a normal color, which maybe I'll leave as white this time. Highlighted color, I'm going to make that teal again. And then pressed color, I will make green again for this one. All right. And I'm just going through quickly fixing this up. So we'll leave normal alone. Highlighted, we'll make teal again. And then, all right, we'll do green for pressed. And I'm just going to leave all of those alone. Okay, so now that we've set this up, let's go ahead and hit play, and we can just sort of watch what happens, because already our mouse should be doing the things we've done, right? When we roll over a button, it highlights. When we click on a button, it turns green. On the slider, right, again, this thing turns green or white, or if I'm over it, for whatever reason, highlighting it only seems to work once. I don't know why that change happened. Maybe it's because it's selected. And yep, there we go, right? Because if I click on it, then it's selected, right? And so it's going to stay white until I select something else, right? So that just lets me know that that material is selected. Now, something else to note, when the slider is selected, you can use the arrow keys to step up and step down on that slider. So that's just something that's set up by default with the way things are set, right? So I can just click, but nothing's happening because I haven't assigned any behaviors to these. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this. And we're going to start assigning these, and we're going to do this with a graph in Bolt. So the first thing we want to do is we've differentiated the text on the buttons, but we didn't differentiate the button names. So I'm going to select the top button, which should be, the text of that should be button 1, wherever my text is at. Oh, right. So my text on the text object is button 1, but I need to make sure I can see this in my hierarchy. And because we're going to be referencing these things, we need to set this up. So I'm going to say this will be button 1. And then I'm going to jump down to the next one. I'm going to call this one button 2. And then I'm actually going to subtract all of these because that's going to be the next step we need to do. Okay. So we've got our button 1, button 2, and our slider. Fantastic. If you wanted to, the slider could be in the middle, so it's all organized the way it is on the screen from left to right, but it doesn't really matter. So the next thing we need to do is we need to create a flow graph, and we need a place to put that. So probably the best thing to do is to create an empty object, and we're going to name this object UI controller. And I'm going to click on, and once I have this UI controller created, I'm going to click on Add Component, Flow Machine, and I want to create a new macro. Now, I've already created a graph called UI controller as I was working through this, making sure I didn't make any crazy mistakes during the tutorial. So I'm going to go ahead and choose UI controller, but please just go ahead and create a new macro called UI controller, and then click on Edit Graph. And I've got some stuff in here that I'm going to disappear real quick. So you should have the start and update function or update events, which you can select and delete. You do not need those. But the next thing that we're going to need to do is we're going to need to create a scene variable for each one of these buttons, sliders, etc., whatever we want to use. And this is like the simplest way to do this. There's more, depending on how much stuff is going on in terms of UI interface, there are probably more elegant ways to do this, but this will get you started. and we'll cover many cases where you have a few buttons or sliders or things that you want to click on. So let's go ahead and start this process. So first, what I need to do is I need to create several scene variables because I need to be able to reference these buttons. Right, they're not prefabs, so I need to be able to reference them in my macro. So I'm going to go ahead and go to scene, and I'm going to call one, surprisingly enough, button 1. I'm going to hit plus. I'm going to change the type to button, so I'm just going to type BUN button, which we may not have even known was a thing you can do, but it is. So I have button, and then it says none right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the little dot, and I'm going to select button 1 from my scene. And then I'm going to go ahead and create button 2. And it seems like it doesn't matter if these names are identical to the names in the hierarchy. It works. So I'm going to make this a button as well. So, just type in but. And then I'm going to choose button 2. I will create a variable for the slider. And I'm going to type in slider, and there we go. And then I will choose my slider. Okay, so I've created variables for all of these things. And rather than have these attached to these different buttons, which, if I was going to do something where I wanted to create a one slider that had functionality that, was similar across, maybe I'm pulling in a separate variable or modifying a separate variable, but I don't want to do this over and over again, or have just a huge graph in here. I could have these as prefabs, or I could have graphs attached to the buttons themselves, so that, each button has its own graph, and then, you tweak a little bit on there. It really depends on what you're doing. But in this case, let's go ahead. We have our UI selected, we're editing our graph. And so now we need to have an event that will make sure we're selecting button 1, button 2, or whatever. So I'm going to go ahead and right click, and I'm just going to type in on button click. And so if I click on button click, you'll note that by default, right, it's set to self, and the UI controller is not a button, so this would never be true. We need to tell it what button we're clicking. So I'm going to start with button 1. I'm going to click and drag button 1 down here, which I don't know why. Sometimes it doesn't really want to go into my graph. Oddly, if this is selected, it did not want to pull it in. So I deselected that and then pulled it in. And then I just want to connect this in here so it knows it's getting button 1. Right now, there's probably a simpler way to check what button's being clicked and work from there as well, but I'm not too worried about that right now. Okay, so in this case, we're going to instantiate an object based on this button click, because it's a simple way to show that it's working. And so I'm going to click on the flow here, click again. I'm going to type in inst, which should, maybe I'll type in instant. There we go. Instantiate, and I'm just going to go to original position and rotation. For rotation, I am going to do, what is it? It's the quaternion, but it's, I always forget which one it is. It's not the literal. Quaternion identity get, right? Because it just needs to be at the default rotation there. In terms of position, I'm going to set the position up to, let's just set it at 10 in the Y. And then in terms of objects, let's go ahead and quickly create a new object, and we'll make it we could either make it a prefab, or we could just create a scene variable for it. So let's go ahead, and I'm just going to create a sphere. I'm going to call this, and I'll rename it to button 1 drop. And then I'm going to add a rigid body onto this so that it falls when it starts. I'm going to leave gravity on, right? And this is just going to be a sphere that instantiates and drops. Now the issue is, right, it's going to need to be a prefab because I don't want this object in the scene or enabled or anything to start with. and I just want it to instantiate 10 units up. So I'm going to go to my project. I actually have my prefabs folder open right now, so just go to your prefabs and then just drag this button 1 drop in here. You could apply a material to it if you want to. It doesn't really matter. But so now I've got this button 1 drop here, and I'm actually going to go ahead, and since I've made this a prefab, now I can delete this copy. I can go back to my UI controller, go back to my flow graph, and now in terms of the original, I can change this to assets, and I can type, you know, what is it? Button 1 drop is the only option in there. And there we go. Right, so now this should work. So let's go ahead and test our button 1. Okay, so this is running. If I hover over button 1, it turns blue. If I click, then a sphere drops down and falls right in the scene. If I click again, another sphere drops down and bounces on top of that one. What's entertaining is because of the way that where they're falling, I think the collider for this object is holding them in place, because they're landing directly on top of each other and bouncing. Or maybe there's just no noise in there in where they're bouncing, right? But you get the idea that somehow these are all stacking directly on top of each other. It's really impressive, given that they're spheres. So that's working. Fantastic. Okay, so for the other ones, we just do something very similar. We can even, whether or not I'm instantiating something or doing something else, I can select at least these 2 things, copy them and paste them, and then just change from button 1 to button 2. And now we say on button click, and we can do something else with this one. I am going to just have it, because I want this to be quick and I can't think of anything off the top of my head, I'm just going to go ahead and instantiate something else. But maybe I will instantiate it at, 2 in the X position. And instead of button drop, I'll just choose one of my other prefabs that I've already made. Maybe I'll just do if I type in health, sure, I'll just add this. This is going to give me some errors because there's a graph attached to it that's going to be problematic because there's variables that don't exist that are going to be referenced, but it should still work. So let's go ahead and run this. And I might not see it because I don't know if it has gravity attached or not. So, so I've got this, that's working. Click on button 2, you can see it's working, but I can't see it. But if I zoom out over here, you will see that it did actually instantiate it up in space. I just don't have gravity turned on for that object. Okay, and you'll see I got an error down here, and that's because the variable that controls the speed of that object doesn't exist, so it's just sort of staying static. Okay, so for the slider, things are a little different because we're not so concerned about the click. What we're interested in is this value changing. And so if I double click into my flow graph and make this full scale so you can see it better, and I right click, I'm going to say slider on change. There we go. So we have slider on value changed, and what we want to do is we want to get this. Now note, you can set it as well. So you could have something happening in your scene that adjusts a slider. That could potentially be a way to do, to show health points going up or going down. But in our case, we're going to be getting this. And obviously we don't want this on, oh, actually that's the wrong thing. We don't want to use that at all. Let's hold on a second. Here we go. So we have on toggle value changed, which we haven't talked about toggles yet, but that's another UI element, which is basically like a checkbox. We're going to say on slider value changed. There we go. Now it's an event, right? So there's times when that other unit you would use where it's not the event that you're looking for, but you're just checking the value at some point during gameplay. And so obviously we don't want this to be self, right? And so we're going to need to pull our scene variable in. So I click over here, find my slider variable, drag it in here, and drag this over. There we go. And so then there's 2 outputs here. There's the flow, and there's this variable, this variance here. And so the question is going to become, what do I want to adjust in the scene that is a value between whatever the low end of my slider is and whatever the high end of my slider is. Right now, I believe we just have it set to 0 to 0, 1. And what we can do is, in our case, we don't have a whole lot going on here. Something that would be simple is to actually, we could change the position of the camera. Maybe we zoom the camera in on the scene as we adjust this, right? So maybe what we're going to want to do is adjust the position of the Z direction of our camera. So the first thing we're going to need to do is let's go ahead and create a scene variable just called camera, because we need to be able to pull this in, right, since it's not a prefab and we're using a macro. So I'm going to say camera, and the type is going to be, surprisingly enough, camera. And then we just need to choose our main camera. So we've done that, and now we can go back to our UI controller. And if I zoom out a little bit, there we go. And pull down option and zoom back in. So I'm going to go ahead and pull my camera in here. And what I want to do with this camera is I want to click over here, and I just want to do the transform. I want to I want to get the transform dot position, and actually all I want to do is set that position, right? So I don't even really need to get it, but I do need to create a new slider now, or a new vector 3, so I can feed this in here. So I'm going to go ahead and click add unit and just say new vector 3, and I want the XYZ because we're going to be doing the Z value. So I'm going to take the flow from here. I'm going to take this value and I'm going to put it directly in here, and I'm going to show you how we can make some modifications to the slider in order to make that the right range. Because right now it starts at -10 and we want it to go maybe to -1 or something like that. We don't want it to be running from 0 to 1 or whatever the default is now. So I'm going to feed this in here. I'm going to feed the flow in here. And before we do anything else, let's go ahead and select our slider. And down here in the slider settings, we have our minimum value and our maximum value. So let's go ahead and set our minimum value to -10, which is where it is currently, and our maximum value to -1. Okay, so I've done that. So now let's go ahead and run this and see if we can zoom our camera in and out. Now, what may happen is it just depends on where the slider is set at the default, if it's at the beginning or the end of the route. Let's see here. Oh, so there we go, right? So I was able to, adjust this position. Let's click on our camera while we do this to see what's changing. Yep, so you can see that value in my transform changing. You'll note that something else changed as well. For some reason, y is 0, and that's probably because in the graph I did not set it anywhere different. So I'm going to go ahead and stop that. And I'm going to set this to, I have it set to almost 3, so I'm just going to set it to 3 there. Okay, so now if I run this, it should slide, and it may pop all the way in again. We'll see what happens. As soon as I click on this, it's probably, yep, it's going to go close, right? So I have the slider setting here, but really, it'd be nice if it started at the low end of the slide. Let's see if I can get that to happen just by selecting my slider here. And yeah, right here I have the value range at the very bottom here is set to -1. If I set that to -10 to start with, right, this basically just says what should this be when we start. I'm going to leave it at -10, and then I should be able to slide to zoom in with that setting, right? And so, right, sliders give you clearly floating point values, and so I can zoom in and out with my camera now with this slider. Okay, so these are the basics of how you use Bolt to create, functionality with your scene.